Becoming Madame Mao by Anchee. Book review. So this book, this isn't actually a history, this is a historical novel about Anchee, about Madame Mao by Anchee. Although as far as I know, it's largely historically accurate. It's one of those historical novels which is very heavy on the history, but just presenting it in novel form. I love these books. I'm a big history buff, but I'm also a bit lazy. I hate reading through kind of any dry or academic history. I much prefer to get my history from the skilled storyteller of a novelist. So Madame Mao, I think, is one of those people, those historical figures that everyone recognizes. Most people recognize. I mean, everyone knows Mao, of course. I think most people know about Madame Mao and the Gang of Four and stuff like that. But very few people really know anything about her. And I'd include myself in that category, like before I read this book. The story I thought I was going to get was completely different than the story I actually got. So I'm someone who, I guess I'm a leftist, so I'm sympathetic to the early ideals of the Chinese Communist Revolution, you know, like the Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s and the 1930s. And then, of course, it all went horribly wrong under Mao. So I was expecting the story of Madame Mao to be kind of the story of, you know, like a sympathetic idealist who, along with Mao, just kind of got corrupted by power. Kind of the classic story of revolution, you know, Robespierre or Oliver Cromwell or Fidel Castro, or just all these stories about revolutionaries who start out very idealist and then get corrupted by power. Turns out that's not Madame Mao's story at all. Her story is the story of a woman driven desperately by the need for love and acceptance. She becomes a communist not primarily because of political reasons, but because of her boyfriend. So she's in Yan'an, she's much more interested in love than in revolution. And she comes into when she comes into power, the same need for love and acceptance caused her to participate in some of the worst political atrocities of the 20th century. What's interesting about Madame Mao is she doesn't really change. The circumstances change. So in the first half of the book, the same characteristics which make her so sympathetic, her need for love and acceptance, are what make her a demon in the second half of the book. In this way, I thought the story was almost Shakespearean in nature, at least as I understand it. Now, I'm not a Shakespeare scholar, but I did take a college course in Shakespeare once. And one of the themes I remember from that college course, one of the things my professor emphasized, is that in Shakespeare's tragedies, the tragic flaw is never something that's inherently bad. It's something that becomes bad in the particular circumstances of that hero. So, for example, Hamlet is indecisive, and that ends up being a tragic flaw. But somebody like Othello or Romeo is kind of rash and too quick to make decisions. And that becomes like a tragic flaw in their situation. And the irony is, if you switch them around, if you put like Hamlet in Othello's play or Othello in Hamlet's play, then everything would be fine. So it's not the characteristics themselves which are inherently bad. It's in these situations, these particular characteristics become a tragic flaw. I thought maybe the same thing was kind of coming through in the story of Madame Mao. She was just so desperate for love and acceptance. And initially, in the first part of the story, that's what made her so sympathetic, and what kind of made the reader kind of feel for her, and what makes the reader kind of root for her. But then, when she comes into power, the fact that she is so desperate for love from everybody makes her such a terrible person, because if she feels she's not getting the love and acceptance from somebody, then she can take terrible revenge on people who aren't giving her the love and acceptance she needs. Anchee Men is able to create a great balance in this book. Madame Mao, I think, is one of the great monsters of history, kind of looking back at her whole legacy. And this book is certainly not a whitewash. And yet, even until the end, the reader does retain some sympathy for Madame Mao. And Anchee Men is able to achieve this through an interesting narrative style. There are actually two narrators in the book. One is the first-person narration, which is told entirely from Madame Mao's perspective. So you're getting to see the events as Madame Mao would have seen it. The other is a more objective third-person narration, which will insert some of the facts that the first-person narrator is leaving out. Now, about 1/3 of the book takes place before Madame Mao even meets Mao, or gets involved in the Chinese Communist Party. It's back when she was just a struggling actress in Shanghai. In many ways, this is the best part of the book. Once the story gets to the political parts, the Chinese Communist Party and the rise in Madame Mao in power, often not enough background information is given to kind of understand the significance of the events. And just looking around at other reviews on Amazon.com or Goodreads or something, this is one of the most common complaints people had about this book. Seemed to me, just from skimming over these other reviews. Now, in my case, I actually have some background with this history. I took a couple college courses on it. One course in recent Chinese history, and one course in Chinese politics, which was also essentially a recent history course. So I had some background on this. If you don't have any background, one book that I can recommend very highly is called Wild Swans by, I think this is pronounced Jung Chang, Jungchang. This book was actually assigned in both of the courses I took in college. Both the Chinese history course and the Chinese political course had this book as assigned reading. And it's a fascinating read. Can't recommend it enough. It's a memoir, but it also is a memoir interspersed with the history of 20th century China. So that book should give you most of the background you would need to kind of understand the politics kind of going on in Madame Mao, or just 20th century China in general. Fascinating book. But Becoming Madame Mao is equally worth reading. Wild Swans helps to give a broader picture of what's going on in all of China during this time. But Madame Mao shows a little bit more the behind-the-scenes intrigue of the Communist Party. Now, in addition to being interested in Chinese history, I've also always been kind of a Roman history buff. In reading Becoming Madame Mao, it made me think a lot about kind of the history of the Roman emperors. The overindulgence is fully on display here. The paranoia that these people develop, all the backstabbing. In fact, in a lot of ways, I was reminded of the novel I, Claudius by Robert Graves, about kind of the backstabbing and paranoia and overindulgence of the early Roman emperors. And in fact, there are even more parallels. I felt like Mao was almost kind of playing the part of Augustus Caesar, somebody who's in power, but he's developing a paranoia of everyone around him. Madame Mao was like the Empress Livia, Augustus Caesar's wife, who, at least in the novel I, Claudius, is doing all this scheming to manipulate the succession. Deng Xiaoping, I thought, was almost parallel to Tiberius, somebody who's completely, well, not completely, but somebody who's on the outside, and you think, oh, he's never going to get into power, like he's kind of been exiled from favor, and yet, against all odds, he ends up becoming the successor to Mao. Now, the parallel admittedly doesn't work if you press it too hard. Because in I, Claudius, Livia is scheming to get Tiberius back into favor and get Tiberius back into power. And Madame Mao and Deng Xiaoping are on opposite sides. They're scheming against each other. So the parallel breaks down a little bit there. But still, the kind of paranoia and the succession narrative and the kind of unlikely person coming in from the outside to become the next successor did kind of remind me of the I, Claudius novels. There's also a lot of fascinating stories that emerge from just this bizarre new imperial court in China. One of them is the story of the composer Yu. So Yu is imprisoned for political crimes. He's suddenly freed by Madame Mao just because she likes his music. And you get this bizarre story in the novel of this shaken man. He's still in prison clothes. He doesn't know what's happening to him. He's embraced by Madame Mao. And then he's rushed onto stage to receive applause from an audience before he even knows what's happening. Just one of those bizarre, interesting stories from this book. There's another interesting little story I thought was interesting of the end of Madame Mao's life. So here she is. She's the most powerful person in China. And then after she falls out of power, she's put in prison. And she spends her last days stitching dolls for export as part of the prison labor. And just because she's so bored, she amuses herself by stitching her name into the dolls. So all these dolls that are going out for export have, Madame Mao's signature stitched into them. Until somebody finds out, and she's eventually stopped. But yeah, just one of those bizarre little stories which makes history so interesting.